Two people stood in the hallway of a Kentucky clinic and refused to walk through the door. A brother and a sister, Patrick and Rachel Ritchie. She kept her back flat against the wall. He stayed hunched near the doorway, shoulders pulled in, standing the way a person stands when he has spent 40 years being looked at. Their skin was blue, not gray, not bruised, blue, the color of deep water in shade, across the face, the hands, the lips, the beds of the fingernails. It was the fall of 1960 in the town of Hazard, and the man who had come to meet them had driven to the end of a gravel road and walked the rest of the way in, because there was no road that went any further. His name was Madison Cawein III. He was a hematologist at the University of Kentucky's clinic in Lexington, and he had come up into the mountains chasing a rumor he had heard from a nurse. The rumor itself is worth pausing on. A nurse named Ruth Pendergrass had encountered a blue-skinned woman years earlier at a county health clinic and had never been able to let it go. She was the one who put the story in front of a hematologist. Without her, the Fugates stay a piece of mountain folklore, and the enzyme stays unnamed for another generation. He had prepared for a difficult diagnosis. He had not prepared for two adults who would not sit in a waiting room. Later he wrote that they were deeply embarrassed about being blue. Now hold the picture, because the blood chemistry in this story took him about a week to solve. The hallway took 140 years, and nobody had ever been sent to look at it. Start where the line starts. In 1820, a French orphan named Martin Fugate crossed the Atlantic, made his way inland, and settled beside a stream in eastern Kentucky called Troublesome Creek. He married a local woman with pale red hair. By the accounts that survive, 4 of their children were born blue. Neither parent had any idea what that meant. Nobody in Kentucky did. Genetics did not exist as a science yet. Gregor Mendel would not plant his first pea for another 36 years. So the creek did what a place with no explanation does. It built one. And here is the detail that decides everything downstream. There was nowhere to go. Troublesome Creek had no railway and no road out. The valley held about 5 families: the Fugates, the Combses, the Ritchies, the Smiths, the Stacys. And for 4 generations, those 5 names married each other, because the alternative was a 2-day walk over a mountain. That is the entire engine of this story. A recessive trait needs 2 carriers to meet. In an ordinary town, 2 carriers almost never do. In that valley, they could barely avoid it. So the blue kept surfacing, not steadily, in flashes, a generation apart, skipping a whole branch and then reappearing in a cousin's newborn, which made it look less like inheritance and more like a verdict being handed down. The best documented of them was a woman named Luna Fugate. People who saw Luna said she was the bluest of the entire line. Blue right up to the whites of her eyes. Blue her whole life, never once anything else. She married a man named John Stacey in the late 1800s. They had 13 children. She lived to 77. Read that again because it detonates the entire premise. 77 years in Appalachia in the 1800s with no doctor within a day's walk. 13 pregnancies carried to term. Her children worked. Her children buried her in old age, not early. Whatever was in that family's blood was not killing them. It was not weakening them. It was not shortening a single life on record. They were not sick. 140 years of avoidance, of whispering, of marriages that closed in on themselves, and there was no illness underneath any of it. So what exactly had Cawein driven up the mountain to cure? Hold that question. He was about to walk into it himself. The blue was not confined to one creek either. A related branch settled a few miles over at Ball Creek, and the trait traveled with them, which meant 2 separate hollows in the same county were producing blue children a generation apart with no idea they were the same story. By the 1950s, it was thinning out. Roads had finally been cut through the hills. Coal work pulled families north toward Ohio and Indiana. The 5 surnames started marrying strangers, and the odds collapsed back toward ordinary. The blue was quietly disappearing out of eastern Kentucky, the way a rumor disappears, without anyone ever having found out what it was. That is the moment Cawein went looking for it. He started by clearing the obvious answers. Blue skin in a clinic almost always means the blood is short on oxygen, and short on oxygen almost always means the heart or the lungs. He tested the heart. Normal. He tested the lungs. Normal. By every measure he had, Patrick and Rachel Ritchie were healthy people. Then he drew their blood. It came out of the vein the color of chocolate, dark brown, not red. He set it in the open air, where ordinary blood turns bright within seconds, and it stayed brown. That was the answer, sitting in a glass tube. Inside your red blood cells, there is a protein called hemoglobin, and its only job is to carry oxygen. It can get stuck in a jammed form that cannot carry anything, and everyone's body carries a trace of the jammed version, under 1%, along with a small enzyme whose entire purpose is to unjam it. The Fugates were missing that enzyme. The condition has a name, methemoglobinemia. Kewine traced it to the missing enzyme in 1964. The hematologists Melanie Percy and Terence Lappin identified exactly which one in 2008. Without it, the jammed protein accumulates. The Fugates were running at 10 to 20% instead of 1. Not enough to starve the body, not enough to cost them a year of life. But the jammed protein is a deep blue-brown pigment, and at that concentration, it shows straight through the skin. That is all of it. One missing enzyme, a pigment sitting in the blood. 140 years of gossip resting on a protein nobody could see. So Kewine went to fix it, and the fix is the part nobody believes the first time. The most effective way to convert the jammed protein back into working hemoglobin is a dye. It opens a backup pathway inside the cell that normally sits idle and unused. The dye is called methylene blue. The cure for being blue was more blue. He injected Patrick and Rachel Ritchie in that clinic. A nurse named Ruth Pendergrass was standing beside him, and her account is the reason the moment exists on the record at all. She said they changed color in front of her. It took minutes. The blue drained out and pink came up underneath it, in a hallway in Hazard, Kentucky, in front of two people who had never once in their lives seen themselves that color. The effect wore off. The body clears the dye. So they carried tablets afterward and took them the way you take a vitamin. In 1982, the writer Kathy Trost tracked the family down for a long piece in the magazine Science 82. And it is her reporting, alongside Kewine's own case papers, that preserves most of what is known about them. Now, go back to Luna Fugate and her 77 years and answer the question that was left open. Kewine was not saving anyone's life. He could not have been. At the levels these people carried, the condition was medically close to harmless, a finding sitting quietly inside a healthy body. There was no disease here in the ordinary sense of the word. What he had invented was a drug for the way a room goes quiet when you enter it. He treated the color because the color was the injury, not to the tissue, to the life built around the tissue, the hallway instead of the waiting room, the shoulders pulled in, the century of being explained by strangers who never asked. And that reaction is not a Kentucky problem. Your brain sorts a face in about 1/10 of a second before any part of you has formed a thought about it. The deviation gets flagged first. The reason arrives second, and by the time it does, it is doing cleanup on a decision that was already made without it. The Valley never had a reason for the Fugates. It had a reflex, and it spent 140 years building a reason on top of it. There is one more scene, and it closes the file. In 1975, in a hospital near Hazard, a baby was born so blue the delivery room stopped. Blue to the point of purple. Staff moved fast, oxygen, an ambulance, 116 miles to the University of Kentucky Medical Center. And by the second day, they were preparing him for a complete blood transfusion, because the alternative was admitting they had no idea what they were looking at. Nobody in that delivery room had a diagnosis. What they had was a newborn the color of a bruise, a set of normal vital signs that made no sense next to him, and a clock running. His grandmother was in the room. She asked the doctors whether they had ever heard of the blue people of Troublesome Creek. The transfusion was called off. The boy's name was Benjamin Stacy, and his great-grandmother was Luna. The blue faded from his skin within a few weeks. He is recorded as the last documented member of the line born that color. 155 years after a French orphan settled beside a creek, the whole thing ended with a grandmother in a corridor saying one sentence out loud, a sentence that would have saved 4 generations upstream of her, if anyone had ever handed it to them. Nobody in that valley was ever sick. They were seen. And the seeing did all of it. The avoidance, the closed marriages, the 2 adults who could not make themselves walk through a door. So the next time a face stops you for a fraction of a second before you have decided anything at all, notice the gap. That fraction of a second is where this entire story lived. 2 people stood in the hallway of a Kentucky clinic and refused to walk through the door. A doctor drove into the mountains to find out why they were blue. What he found, standing against that wall, was every person who had ever looked at them. K-wine could drain the blue out of a man's skin in minutes. What he could never explain is why a single missing enzyme sitting in a healthy body was enough to close a family indoors for 150 years. That gap between what the body was doing and what the valley believed never fully closed. This channel keeps pulling on gaps like that one. Subscribe and stay in the space between what you see and what's actually there.